They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. A place so secure that no one has ever escaped, and so isolating that many never escape their own minds. Inside ADX Florence, America's most secure supermax prison, time doesn't pass, it freezes. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in concrete tombs, staring at walls instead of faces. Before we dive in, if you're ready to uncover the truth about how the US government built a modern-day fortress for the forgotten, hit subscribe and let's step inside the walls of ADX Florence. High in the desolate desert of Colorado, surrounded by barbed wire and red rock mountains, stands a fortress that redefines the word maximum. The United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, ADX Florence, was designed not for ordinary criminals, but for those deemed too dangerous, too notorious, or too disruptive for any other prison in America. Opened in 1994, ADX was built in the aftermath of violent chaos. In the 1980s and early 1990s, high-security prisons across the U.S. were plagued by murders, stabbings, and organized gang violence behind bars. The federal government's response was simple: create a place where control could not be lost, where communication would be impossible, where the most feared inmates would vanish from the system, without ever leaving it. The blueprints for ADX Florence were drawn with one purpose: total isolation. Each cell measures 7 by 12 feet, built entirely of reinforced concrete. The bed, desk, and even the stool are carved from the same unyielding material. A narrow window, just 4 inches wide, points upward toward the sky, angled so that prisoners can see nothing but a sliver of daylight. No mountains, no horizon, no movement, just light. The men sent here are names that once dominated headlines: terrorists, gang leaders, and escape artists. Theodore Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Ramzi Youssef, the 1993 World Trade Center bomber. Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, the Mexican drug lord who once tunneled his way out of prison in Mexico but now faces concrete thicker than any tunnel he could dig. Inside ADX they call it clean version of hell. For some it's worse than death. Every movement is controlled. Doors open only when triggered remotely from a control room. Meals are slid through a slot. Conversations are replaced by silence so complete that some prisoners report hearing their own heartbeats echoing against the concrete. The design was intentional. It was psychological architecture, built not only to confine the body but to erode the mind. In the early years, wardens described ADX as the place to send the worst of the worst. But what the world didn't see were the men who slowly began to unravel inside those walls. The U.S. Bureau of Prisons claimed the isolation was necessary for safety. Yet, lawsuits and leaked reports began to tell another story, a story of mental collapse, self-mutilation, and desperate acts of madness. Inmates scratched messages into the walls using their own fingernails. Some smeared blood or feces in patterns they believed would send signals through the ventilation system. Others screamed into the void, only to be met with echoes of their own despair. What began as America's most controlled prison was quietly becoming its most haunted one. The first warning signs appeared in the early 2000s. When reports began leaking out, letters smuggled by attorneys, statements from former guards, and psychological evaluations that painted a grim picture of life inside. But the truth didn't fully emerge until a decade later when a lawsuit, Cunningham vs. Federal Bureau of Prisons 2012, forced the U.S. government to face what it had long denied, that even the strongest minds could break inside ADX Florence. In 2012, a quiet legal document filed in a Colorado courtroom ripped open the sealed walls of ADX Florence for the first time in its history. The case, Cunningham vs. Federal Bureau of Prisons, would become one of the most significant legal battles in the history of American incarceration. At the center of the case was a man named Jack Powers, a former bank robber who had spent years inside ADX. His story was one of torment, self-destruction, and survival. Powers was sent to ADX for multiple escape attempts. But once inside he found himself trapped in something far more inescapable than bars or fences: his own mind. Over time, Powers began hearing voices. He saw things that weren't there. His mental illness worsened under the relentless pressure of isolation. In desperation he mutilated himself, carving into his flesh and even attempting suicide multiple times. His cries for help went unanswered for years. Letters to prison psychologists were returned with cold denials. No clinical indication for mental illness. When Powers joined forces with a group of other inmates and a team of attorneys from the law firm Arnold & Porter, the truth began to surface. Their collective lawsuit revealed what many inside already knew, that ADX was not just a prison, but a psychological experiment without consent. Through sworn affidavits, reports, and shocking testimonies, the Cunningham case unveiled scenes that defied imagination. One inmate had gouged out his own eyes after years in isolation. Another bit through his own wrist arteries in a suicide attempt. There were men who smeared feces on themselves, others who screamed endlessly through the night, and many who simply stopped speaking altogether. These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns, symptoms of what experts called SHU psychosis. SHU, or Special Housing Unit, is another term for solitary confinement. But at ADX, solitary was not temporary punishment, it was life. 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, 1 hour alone in a barren recreation pen nicknamed the Dog Run. That recreation area was a small, caged rectangle of concrete and metal. Inmates could see only a patch of sky through the mesh ceiling. There was no grass, no human contact, only the sound of their own chains rattling as they tried to stretch their legs. The lawsuit accused the Bureau of Prisons, BOP, of violating the Eighth Amendment, the constitutional protection against cruel and unusual punishment. The claim was simple yet devastating. ADX was knowingly housing mentally ill prisoners in conditions that worsened their illnesses, driving some to suicide and others to madness. Court filings described how prisoners with schizophrenia or severe depression were locked away without proper medication, therapy, or evaluation. Instead, they were disciplined for disruptive conduct, punished for symptoms of their illnesses. The BOP initially denied everything. Officials insisted that ADX was safe, humane, and necessary for national security. But the evidence was overwhelming. Among the exhibits were internal documents showing how guards had written reports mocking inmates' breakdowns. In one memo, a staff member referred to an inmate's suicide attempt as attention-seeking behavior. In another, an officer joked about how long it would take for the crazy one in range 13 to finally snap. Psychiatrists who reviewed the case warned that the conditions inside ADX could induce hallucinations, paranoia, and self-harm even in healthy individuals, let alone those already struggling with mental illness. When Judge Richard P. Match reviewed the evidence, he made a statement that still echoes in legal circles today. If these allegations are true, the BOP has turned its back on its most fundamental responsibility, to protect those it holds captive. The lawsuit didn't seek to shut ADX down. The lawyers knew that was impossible. But it did force the Bureau of Prisons to confront what had been hidden for decades. In 2015, after 3 years of litigation, the BOP reached a settlement agreement. Under its terms, the government admitted no wrongdoing, but it agreed to major reforms. Mentally ill inmates were to be transferred out of ADX and into medical facilities better equipped to handle psychiatric care. The BOP committed to screening new inmates for mental illness before sending them to the supermax. It also promised improved treatment programs for those who remained inside. For the first time, the American public saw what prolonged isolation truly meant, not through documentaries or rumors, but through sworn testimony and legal documents. But the story didn't end with the lawsuit. The changes came slowly and not everyone benefited. For many who had already lost their grip on reality, it was too late. They had become the silent casualties of a system designed to erase them. ADX Florence continued to operate, stronger than ever, more secretive than ever. But now, its myth of control had cracks. The world had caught a glimpse of the truth inside the Alcatraz of the Rockies, and it was darker than anyone imagined. It begins every day the same way, with the sound of metal on metal. At exactly 6 a.m., the slot in each steel door slides open with a sharp clang. A gloved hand pushes through a tray, breakfast. There's no greeting, no eye contact, not even a voice. Just a plastic tray of lukewarm oatmeal, powdered eggs, and a small carton of milk. The slot snaps shut again. Silence returns. That is how a day begins inside ADX Florence, and it's how it has begun for thousands of men over the past 3 decades. The prison operates like a machine, precise, controlled, and emotionless. Every action, every movement, every second is scheduled. Head count follows at 7 a.m. Officers move through each range, the long, echoing corridor lined with thick metal doors. Each inmate must stand at the back of his cell as guards confirm his presence through the narrow glass slit. There's no conversation. Just a number, a nod, and the sound of footsteps fading away. Then the stillness takes over again. Inside these cells, time loses its meaning. There are no clocks, no external noises, and no natural rhythm to mark the day. Many prisoners sleep during daylight and wake through the night simply to break the monotony. The lights, recessed into the ceiling, hum faintly but never fully dim. They stay on 24 hours a day, a faint glow even at night to allow guards to see inside at any moment. Inmates at ADX Florence spend 23 hours a day in isolation. The remaining hour is what the Bureau of Prisons calls recreation. But that word is deceptive. Recreation is not a yard, not a field, not even a gym. It is a concrete box, 20 feet long, 10 feet wide, roofed with steel mesh. The prisoners call it the dog run. There is no equipment, no other people, no sound of life. Just a patch of sky that most describe as both a gift and a curse. A reminder of freedom that remains forever out of reach. When the door to the rec pen opens, inmates are escorted by 2 guards and a 3rd officer holding a camera. Every movement is recorded. Shackles on ankles, cuffs on wrists, a black chain connecting both, the 3-piece suit. Even when the prisoner steps into the empty concrete pit, the restraints stay on until the guard exits and locks the door. That hour of recreation is often the only time an inmate hears another human voice, a muffled conversation echoing from another pen, a few cells down, or across a corridor. Communication between inmates is officially forbidden, but humans are not built for silence. Over the years, the prisoners have developed secret systems to talk through the isolation. Some tap messages through pipes and walls using coded rhythms. Others speak through vents, their words carried through the air ducts like whispers in the dark. They call it vent talk. One former inmate told his lawyer, "It's like learning to talk through ghosts. You can't see who's answering. You just wait and hope someone taps back." Lunch comes around 11 a.m. It's another tray, sometimes a small sandwich, sometimes beans, rarely anything hot. For most inmates, the food is fuel, nothing more. But mealtime is also the highlight of the day, because it's one of the few events that mark the passage of time. The afternoon drifts into sameness. Some inmates read if they're allowed books. Others exercise in their cells, push-ups, squats, sit-ups, over and over again until exhaustion dulls the ache of confinement. A few write letters, though everyone is screened and read by staff before leaving the prison. Family contact is rare. Phone calls are limited to once a month, often shorter. Even attorneys must schedule their visits weeks in advance, and those visits happen through thick glass, with phones that sometimes crackle so badly it's hard to hear a word. By 4 p.m. dinner arrives. It's often cold, served through the same narrow slot. Then another head count. Doors remain locked, lights stay dim but never dark. And so it goes, day after day, week after week, year after year. Some inmates mark time by carving tiny notches into the concrete edges of their tables. Others stop counting altogether. The human mind, deprived of sound, touch, and variety, begins to lose its balance. Psychologists who have studied solitary confinement at ADX describe it as social death. Deprived of interaction, the brain starts to create its own. Inmates report hearing voices that aren't real, seeing movement in the periphery of their vision, feeling as if the walls themselves are breathing. A few cling to routines to stay sane, waking at the same minute every morning, reading the same book, pacing their 7-foot cell exactly 120 times a day. But even those rituals become meaningless under the weight of years. When one former guard testified during the Cunningham case, he described walking the night shift in the range, the high-security wing for the most unstable inmates. You'd hear them talking to themselves, laughing, screaming. Sometimes they'd stop and whisper into the vents, like they were having conversations with ghosts. The architecture of ADX was built to suppress chaos, to silence violence and control the uncontrollable. But in doing so, it created another kind of chaos, one that cannot be seen or stopped. Inside the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the walls don't just hold prisoners. They absorb them. There's a moment in every story from ADX Florence when silence becomes the enemy. At first, inmates describe the quiet as calming, a relief from the noise, the shouting, the chaos of other prisons. But after weeks, that silence deepens. It stops being peaceful and starts to feel alive. In that void, the human mind begins to echo back upon itself. Guards have a term for it, range madness. It's the point when an inmate, deprived of stimulation for too long, begins to lose grip on reality. The symptoms start small, pacing endlessly, muttering under breath, losing track of time. Then come the hallucinations, voices that seem to speak from the vents, shadows that move across walls, sensations of bugs crawling under the skin. These are not rare occurrences at ADX Florence. They are routine. One of the earliest and most haunting examples was William "Billy" Cruz, an inmate who arrived in the early 2000s. Cruz was mentally ill, suffering from schizophrenia long before he entered ADX. In the isolation unit, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He began to talk to imaginary people, then to scream at night, banging on the steel door until his knuckles bled. Other inmates said they could hear him arguing with invisible figures for hours. When he slashed his own arms open in a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, it took guards several minutes to reach him. His blood covered the cell floor by the time medical staff arrived. He survived, but barely. Cruz later told a psychologist, "At least the pain reminds me I'm not dead yet." Another inmate, Brian Nicholson, gouged out his own eyes with his fingernails after years in isolation. His case shocked even the most hardened officers. When questioned, Nicholson said he believed demons were inside his body and that the only way to set them free was to destroy his sight. These acts weren't isolated madness. They were the predictable outcomes of an environment that stripped away every trace of human connection. Psychiatrists describe this phenomenon as SHU syndrome. It's named after the Special Housing Unit, the bureaucratic term for solitary confinement. In ADX Florence, SHU syndrome manifests as paranoia, anxiety, hypersensitivity to noise, insomnia, and in extreme cases, full-blown psychosis. In one recorded interview, a former ADX psychologist explained, "Humans are social animals. When you remove all social interaction, the brain begins to create its own. The mind fills the silence with noise, the loneliness with hallucination." Even the guards weren't immune. Former staff have admitted that working the night shift at ADX Florence could feel like living in a haunted place. They described walking through echoing corridors where the only sounds were muffled screams or the clanging of metal from inmates hitting their doors for hours without rest. For prisoners, the only way to communicate, to prove they still existed, was to make noise. Some tapped messages in code. Some screamed names of inmates they'd never met. Others sang songs, endlessly repeating verses from memory until their voices gave out. In one chilling account, a guard recalled hearing an inmate whispering through the vent system, "Hey, you still there? Don't go quiet on me, man. Don't disappear." The reality was that many already had. A 2014 report from The Atlantic detailed multiple suicides and attempted suicides within ADX, often involving self-strangulation, razor blades, or plastic bags smuggled from food trays. Because of the facility's design, guards rarely intervened quickly enough to save them. The cells were soundproofed, and by the time help arrived, it was often too late. One inmate hanged himself using torn bedsheets. Another repeatedly banged his head against the wall until he collapsed. The official records labeled these as unfortunate incidents. But for human rights observers, they were signs of systemic psychological collapse. Even those who didn't lose their lives lost their sense of self. Long-term solitary confinement changes how the brain works, shrinking areas responsible for emotional regulation and decision-making. Former inmates have described coming out of ADX unable to hold conversations, unable to look people in the eye, afraid of crowds, and addicted to silence. When Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons reached the courts, these stories became evidence. Expert witnesses compared ADX's conditions to torture. They cited research showing that more than half of all suicides in U.S. prisons occur among inmates in solitary confinement. The Bureau of Prisons defended its practices by saying ADX was built to protect the public from unmanageable threats. Yet, behind those thick walls, the threat wasn't just to society, it was to the very souls trapped inside. After the lawsuit's partial reforms, a handful of prisoners were transferred to medical facilities. But hundreds remained. The structure didn't change, the silence didn't stop. Even today, psychologists estimate that hundreds of inmates at ADX suffer from severe mental illness. Most untreated, many undiagnosed. The same walls that keep the world out also keep the truth in. In a letter smuggled out in 2018, one inmate wrote, "We are ghosts in a concrete graveyard. The only difference between us and the dead is that we breathe." ADX Florence was designed to be escape-proof. And in that, it succeeded. But for those who enter, escaping the psychological cage is something few have ever managed. From the outside, ADX Florence looks deceptively simple, low, sand-colored buildings nestled against the red rock landscape of southern Colorado. But beneath that stillness lies one of the most advanced control systems ever built for human confinement. Every inch of the Alcatraz of the Rockies was engineered for dominance, not just physical but psychological. The architecture itself is a weapon. The complex covers 37 acres, surrounded by multiple razor wire fences, motion sensors, infrared cameras, and ground vibration detectors capable of picking up the slightest movement. Beyond that perimeter, there are watchtowers manned around the clock, though most of the surveillance happens silently, through an intricate network of security feeds monitored from a central control hub known simply as the bubble. Inside the bubble, officers sit before rows of monitors showing every hallway, cell door and outdoor pen in real time. They can open or lock any door in the facility at the push of a button. Each sound, each movement, each breath is recorded, cataloged and archived. Human contact is virtually eliminated by design. When an inmate moves, for medical visits, recreation or showers, every step is pre-planned. 2 guards escort him, 1 on each arm, while a third films the entire process. Before leaving his cell, the inmate kneels with his hands behind his back, fingers interlocked. He's cuffed, shackled, searched and fitted with a waist chain. Even during a brief walk to the shower, there's no eye contact, no small talk, only commands: kneel, stand, turn left. It's not just control, it's conditioning. The cells themselves are technological marvels of containment. The doors are solid steel with narrow food slots. The concrete beds are immovable, the furniture indestructible. Windows are angled upward so inmates can't see the horizon, the mountains, or even other buildings. The effect is intentional: disorientation. The world beyond disappears. ADX was built following the concept of total control architecture. It's the idea that a prison structure can enforce obedience without physical violence. If the design prevents communication, escape, or defiance, the guards don't have to intervene. The environment itself does the work. Each housing unit, called a range, contains about a dozen cells. Prisoners never see each other, yet they're constantly aware that they're being watched. Cameras in every corridor, microphones embedded in ceilings, movement sensors on doors. It's the panopticon brought to life. The panopticon is a centuries-old concept. A prison design where inmates can never tell when they're being watched, forcing them to regulate their own behavior. At ADX, that theory has reached its final form. Inmates no longer rebel because rebellion becomes meaningless. There's no audience, no reaction, no human witness. Even the staff operate under strict isolation protocols. Guards rarely interact with the same inmates twice in a row, and rotations prevent familiarity. Relationships are discouraged. No one gets attached. But this system, built for perfect control, has its flaws, and those flaws reveal the cost of such precision. Former guards have described the psychological toll of working in an environment so quiet and sterile it feels like being buried alive. Some officers confessed that they began to experience anxiety and insomnia after just months inside. Others reported that the monotony eroded their empathy, that they started to see inmates not as people, but as moving shadows on security screens. Even technology has limits. When the power fails, which happens occasionally during Colorado's harsh winters, the silence turns from oppressive to terrifying. Without the constant hum of electronics, guards have reported hearing faint screams, metal scraping, and the echo of voices that seem to come from nowhere. In those moments, ADX Florence feels less like a prison and more like a tomb that breathes. For inmates, every element of the design reinforces the same message: you are not in control. The shower units are automated, water runs for exactly 10 minutes before shutting off. The lights are controlled remotely. Even the air vents can be adjusted to maintain a constant, sterile chill. Inmates cannot alter their environment in any way, not even to dim a light or close a vent. The most infamous area is the control unit, also known as Range 13. It's reserved for the most violent or unstable prisoners, those who've attacked staff or attempted escape. In Range 13, the cells are smaller, the isolation deeper. Guards speak through intercoms rather than face-to-face. One prisoner there once wrote, "You start to think the building is alive, that it knows when you breathe, when you blink, when you lose hope." Despite the technological precision, ADX is not immune to human failure. Leaked reports have revealed incidents of guards using excessive force, of inmates being left in restraints for hours, of medical neglect when mental breakdowns turned violent. But such incidents rarely make headlines. The facility is too secretive, too fortified, too remote. Even the nearest town, Florence, Colorado, seems disconnected from the reality just miles away. Locals refer to ADX as the zoo. Few have ever seen inside. The prison sits quietly, its beige walls blending with the desert, hiding the machinery of control beneath a sky too wide and free for those it imprisons. For the world, ADX is a symbol of security, the ultimate fortress. For those inside, it's something else entirely, a machine built to erase human will. And while no one has ever escaped its walls, the question remains: can the human mind truly survive a place designed to destroy everything that makes it human? Behind the steel doors of ADX Florence are names that once made the world tremble. Men whose crimes shaped history, whose faces filled news screens, whose power once seemed untouchable. now reduced to a number, a schedule, and a cell. One of the most famous is Theodore Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber. For nearly 2 decades, Kaczynski waged a campaign of terror across the United States, sending mail bombs that killed 3 people and injured dozens. When he was captured in 1996, the government feared he could still inspire others. ADX was chosen to silence him. In cell 190, Kaczynski lived in total isolation for more than 25 years. His neighbors were men he would never meet: Zacarias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker of 9/11, Ramzi Youssef, who masterminded the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and Eric Rudolph, the Atlanta Olympic Park bomber. Each man infamous, each locked away in identical concrete boxes. Kaczynski's letters to the outside world, carefully censored and delayed by months, revealed his slow unraveling. He wrote of time dripping like acid, of voices in the pipes, and of a constant battle to remain sane. He spent his final years requesting transfer to a medical facility, complaining of pain and isolation. In June 2023 he was found dead by suicide in his cell. Even in death, ADX kept its silence. Another resident of this fortress is Joaquin El Chapo Guzmán, the Mexican drug lord who once controlled the Sinaloa cartel. After his legendary prison escape through a mile-long tunnel in Mexico, the U.S. government vowed he would never see sunlight unguarded again. Today he lives under ADX's Special Administrative Measures, or SAMs, restrictions so severe they limit everything from mail to movement. No contact with other inmates. No interviews. His only human interactions are with guards and lawyers, all monitored. For a man who once commanded an empire of thousands, ADX has stripped him to one reality: silence. Then there's Terry Nichols, accomplice to Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing, and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, the Boston Marathon bomber. Both men live lives measured in routines: meals through slots, showers under supervision, and an hour in the dog run staring at the same small square of sky. Even notorious mobsters like Richard Lee McNair and gang leaders like Larry Hoover of the Gangster Disciples found themselves buried in Florence's depths. Their voices, once commanding armies, now echoing off concrete. What ties these men together isn't just their crimes. It's their slow, irreversible descent into invisibility. Some have described ADX as a clean version of hell. The lights are bright, the floors shine, the corridors smell faintly of bleach, but beneath the surface, it's a place where even the strongest egos fracture. The masterminds, killers, and rebels who once controlled the chaos outside are now swallowed by a system that allows no defiance. Yet, for all its precision, ADX cannot stop time. It only stretches it. Days bleed into weeks, weeks into years. And in that slow erosion, power fades. The legends crumble. When a journalist once asked a former warden of ADX if the men inside ever change, his answer was chilling. They don't change. They dissolve. The story of ADX Florence is not just about concrete and steel. It's about what happens when control becomes obsession. Built to contain chaos, it has created a deeper kind of destruction: the quiet disintegration of the human mind. Your time doesn't heal. It haunts. From the lawsuits of the Cunningham case to the suicides of inmates like Ted Kaczynski, the Alcatraz of the Rockies stands as both a monument to security and a mirror reflecting America's moral dilemma. How far should we go to punish the dangerous, and at what cost to our own humanity? No one has ever escaped ADX Florence. Not because of its walls or guards, but because once you enter, the world forgets you exist. If this story opened your eyes to a side of justice the world rarely sees, help us bring more hidden truths to light. Like, comment, and subscribe, because every view, every share helps uncover another story the world tried to lock away. This is the reality of the Alcatraz of the Rockies, where silence is louder than screams and freedom is only a memory,